I call a member for Kira.
Madam Acting Speaker, thank you for the opportunity to make a brief contribution on this important legislation, and it's always good to see someone from the Illawarra in the chair of this place. Madam Acting Speaker, let me start by acknowledging the Shadow Minister, the member for Cessnock, and his tireless advocacy and work in this space. He has, and those of us in opposition know, with very, very little, if any, resources, worked with other colleagues in the Shadow Cabinet, obviously, namely the Honourable Peter Primrose and the Honourable Adam Searle, if I stand corrected, who have gone through this in detail and worked through what is a very, very difficult and complex piece of legislation, but has huge ramifications for men and women right across our communities. Let me start by also acknowledging the member for Blacktown, who has spoken earlier and who has been, both in his time as the Leader of the Opposition and in his former role within the trade union movement, a tireless advocate for people who have suffered these types of insidious diseases that many of us have raised here today. And it is important that we acknowledge members on our side who have been around and dealt with issues in this space for long periods of time, a lot longer than people like myself. Madam Acting Speaker, I start by also outlining some of the big concerns that we have, and that is, some years ago in this place, I witnessed a debate around the library bill, which had around at the time, I'll stand corrected, but approximately 56 government speakers. Libraries are very important, no doubt about that, and as a person who loves books, I would be the last to say otherwise. But, Madam Acting Speaker, what is really disappointing about this today is that to date, and I'll stand corrected, there's been four government speakers on a bill and an issue that affects those in the community most vulnerable, those in the community who have suffered greatly, and those in the community who continue to suffer. People have often said that the reflection on a government and how good a government is, and the measure of how good a government is, Madam Acting Speaker, is how well they treat the most vulnerable and those in the community who are doing it tough. This bill does not go far enough to rectify or remedy the disaster of 2012, and it was a disaster. The legislation that was moved through then was appalling, disgraceful. It was legislation that I hope never sees the light of day in this chamber again. I would not be a very proud member of government, and I understand why perhaps only four of them have spoken, because after the debacle of 2012, it would be a brave man or woman on that side who came into this place and tried to lecture on the benefits of workers' compensation. There is not a member in this chamber, or I would think there would not be a member, there is certainly not a member on our side, who have not sat with, in the dining rooms, in the lounge rooms, in the electorate offices, with men and women and families who have been treated appallingly through the previous legislation. I myself come to this with what you'd call, I suppose, in this day and age of disclosure, somewhat of an interest. My wife suffered a workplace injury some years ago and has a permanent chronic back issue that those who deal with chronic pain know better than else how debilitating it can be. And the way in which she at times was treated was appalling, but the way in which men and women who have come into my electorate, who I've sat with in their homes, have been treated is nothing short of disgusting. We will always support any improvements to the disastrous 2012 scheme, but what we won't go doing is trying to make a very, very small improvements to the scheme and somewhat improvements to the scheme come at the cost, as the member for Cessnock and the Shadow Minister outlined, at a cost to the very important Dust Diseases Board. Madam Speaker, those of us in the Illawarra know, like yourself, like the member for Wollongong, like myself, and I'd like to think the member for Kiama and the member for Heathcote should know better than most the insidious way in which the disease has affected many of the men and women in our community. Being an industrial town like the Shadow Ministers in the Hunter, we know that this has been part and parcel of the lives of the men and women who have worked within our region. My father worked at Tallawarra Power Station for some time and talks many times about the stories of people kicking and throwing around huge amounts of asbestos blocks and dust in the air long before we knew about the dangers of this insidious fibre and the way in which it destroys lives. What I don't understand about this bill and the dust diseases and the way in which we've gone about this is the complete lack of consultation. Let me tell you, as a former public servant and as a member as a chief of staff to a minister, you know you've stuffed it up when a week after you announce it, you've got to put ads in the paper to say what you meant. That's a pretty good sign you've stuffed it. It is a pretty good sign, Madam Acting Speaker, that it has gone horribly wrong when you are spending taxpayers' money to say something that you should have done months earlier. You know you're in a bit of trouble when you wake up, as I did the other morning, eating the Weet-Bix, and there I see a half-page ad in one of the Sydney papers, I'm sure not cheap, saying, listen, what those baddies in the union movement and the Labor Party are telling you is wrong. Believe us, because we paid for the ads to tell you. Well, Acting Speaker, and unfortunately, during my time, I have lived through the occasional government challenge, and you can bet your bottom dollar that I'd be interested to know whether the minister had any influence over those ads. I'm certainly not accusing him or not, but no doubt he was very supportive of trying to get paid advertising out to explain an issue, because those of us who have worked in government before know that when it gets difficult to get a message through the traditional means, then you obviously have to resort to advertising. The only problem with this system is that it occasionally helps when you bring in legislation. Very occasionally helps if you actually consult with people, just the sort of somewhat minor stakeholders, I suppose, called the Asbestos Diseases Foundation of Australia. Look, it'd be a novel thing to, a bit like having been able to buy a train ticket on a train station in this government, it'd be a novel thing to actually consult with the group that probably stands most affected by the legislation that you intend to introduce. But certainly won't be worrying about telling you about your communication. I'm sure that's working a treat, and I'm sure the paid advertising is fantastic, maybe as a way of trying to reduce a bit of your government expenditure next time. You can do the somewhat cheaper method of emailing, calling, meeting, discussing what you're proposing with stakeholders such as the Asbestos Disease Foundation of Australia. Can I say here and now that I acknowledge that group, the trade union movement, and for those who are out there each and every day representing workers and trying to make sure that they are getting a fair deal when it comes to this legislation. It is a shame this legislation is not separated, because as the Shadow Minister has outlined, we would be willing to try and look at improvements and supporting improvements to what was a disastrous and horrible 2012 legislation. What we won't be doing in this place, however, is passing legislation that we don't think helps people in terms of the way in which they get payments and compensation as they suffer some of the most insidious diseases, and their families look on as they continue to suffer. We will not be a part of that. We will not be held ransom to that. We never will be. And the Shadow Minister can hold his head high, as can every Labor member in this place, about the way in which they have, continue to have, and will always fight for the most vulnerable workers in our community, particularly those who have suffered injuries and illnesses as a result of the simple thing of going to work each and every day.